Philadelphia had fallen, its capture marking a grim moment for the fledgling nation. George Washington's army, battered and exhausted, was spared from utter destruction only by the arrival of winter. As the cold set in, Washington was left with a crucial decision: where to settle his weary troops for the winter. Suggestions poured in. Lancaster, Pennsylvania, with its distance from Philadelphia, offered some isolation from the British, while Wilmington, Delaware posed a more daring option, positioning the Continental Army closest to its enemies. But both carried risks, and Washington, having learned from the previous winter's desperate gamble in New Jersey, wisely knew that another large winter campaign was almost impossible with his depleted forces and lack of surprise. Instead, he focused his efforts and energy on recovery, and a promising location caught his attention: Valley Forge. Nestled on high ground, Valley Forge was close enough to keep a watchful eye on the British in Philadelphia, yet defensible enough to deter attack. The Schuylkill River provided access to vital supplies, and the camp's location allowed Washington to send troops swiftly where they were needed. Washington's plan was clear: rebuild, replenish, and prepare, while quietly containing the British in Philadelphia. Once settled, Washington ordered his soldiers to begin constructing huts, a marked improvement over the tents they had endured in the previous winters. But the reality at Valley Forge was way harsher. With 12,000 troops stationed there, the camp rivaled some of the largest cities in the colonies in population. Yet food was scarce, and as hunger set in, sickness followed. Diseases like typhoid, pneumonia, and dysentery spread through the camp, exacerbated by poor sanitation and inadequate shelter. Despite these hardships and death, Washington's decision to inoculate his troops against smallpox became a stroke of genius, preventing an outbreak of the deadliest disease of the time and saving countless lives. In doing so, Washington had unwittingly led the first ever state-sponsored immunization campaign, a legacy that endures in modern military practices around the world to this day. Morale at the camp was also lifted by the presence of families. Women, including Martha Washington herself, played a vital role, taking on jobs like sewing, cooking, and even sometimes nursing the sick. Martha became a beloved figure in the camp. Her presence was a reminder of home and a symbol of resilience. These families were not just spectators, they were part of the war effort, boosting spirits and improving the life of the soldiers at Valley Forge. Valley Forge was also not just a melting pot of hardship, but also one of hope and diversity. Washington's army was a reflection of the American colonies themselves. 1/4 to 1/3 of its soldiers didn't even speak English, hailing from immigrant communities from France to Germany to other parts of Europe. Free African Americans made up almost 10% of this force, and Native American allies such as the Oneida and Tuscarora tribes arrived to assist, serving as scouts and skirmishers and helping to replenish the strength of the army. Valley Forge, in its own way, symbolized the diverse and united front that the Continental Army was becoming. And then came the arrival of two key European figures, the Marquis de Lafayette and Baron Friedrich von Steuben. Lafayette had already earned Washington's respect through his bravery at Brandywine, but it was von Steuben who would truly transform the Continental Army. A veteran of the Prussian military, von Steuben set to work, drilling the soldiers relentlessly. He taught them how to reload quickly, how to march in disciplined formations, and execute bayonet charges, skills that would be critical in the battles to come. Von Steuben's reforms extended beyond the rank and file. He reshaped the officer corps. He instilled a new sense of responsibility and professionalism, assigning different duties to these men who before had just seen this title as, well, prestige. His influence on the Army's structure and training was so profound that many of the drill techniques he introduced are still used by the U.S. military today. By the spring, the Army had been reshaped, re-energized, and reorganized into 5 different divisions. With their spirits lifted, skills sharpened, and weapons refit, they were indeed ready to fight. The test came in June, when news broke that the British were evacuating Philadelphia. Washington, now bolstered by his revitalized army, followed closely, waiting for the right moment to strike. In a brilliant tactical move, he shadowed the British forces, testing his soldiers in small skirmishes and gaining confidence in their newfound strength. The once disheartened army that entered Valley Forge was now an efficient, cohesive force poised for action. Washington knew the moment had come. The lessons of the winter, forged in the fires of adversity and discipline, were about to be put to the test in the battles that would follow. In Washington's army, no longer the ragtag group of soldiers who had stumbled into Valley Forge, now stood trained, resilient, determined, and ready to fight. This opportunity would arise on the morning of June 28, 1778, when General Charles Lee led a division of the Continental Army on what was supposed to be a bold attack against the British rearguard. At first, things seemed promising as Lee's troops made early progress, but soon the tide shifted. Lee, unaware that he had been outnumbered at this point 2-1, began to panic when he saw the British numbers. Doubting the discipline of his men and fearing that they might break, he hastily ordered a retreat, completely unaware that General Washington was close behind with reinforcements. Lee's premature decision to pull back allowed the British to regain their footing and launch a counterattack, and when Washington arrived on the scene, he was met with absolute and pure chaos. His soldiers, once advancing with confidence, were now retreating in disarray. Furious, Washington confronted Lee on the battlefield, chastising him for his poor judgment, and without hesitation, he stripped Lee of command and took control of the situation himself. Rallying the closest troops, Washington quickly ordered them into a defensive position, buying enough time for reinforcements to arrive and stabilize the battle line. With General Thomas Wayne now commanding Lee's troops and Nathaniel Greene leading another division, Washington devised a counterattack. Artillery was positioned on higher ground, and Greene's forces struck at the British right flank, turning the tide of the battle. The American artillery tore through the British lines, and Greene's counterattack pushed the enemy back further. Cornwallis, determined to regain the upper hand, reorganized his men and launched another counterattack. This moment was critical. Historically, this was when the Continental Army might have broken and fled in the face of such immense British pressure, but not this time. Thanks to the rigorous training and discipline installed at Valley Forge, the American troops held their ground. Supported by artillery, they withstood the British assault, and the battle ground to a stalemate. Fighting continued throughout the day, but tapered off by nightfall, and when morning came, Washington prepared his soldiers for more combat, but the British were gone. They had quietly evacuated to the coast. The battle was indeed over. The Battle of Monmouth, as it would come to be known, was officially a stalemate. Neither side could claim a decisive victory, but for the Americans, the outcome felt like a win. For the first time in the war, the Continental Army had gone toe-to-toe with the British in open battle and held its own. Monmouth proved that the Americans could match the British in terms of discipline, strategy, and tenacity, and it was the first major test of the reforms that had taken place during the long, hard winter at Valley Forge, and the results had spoken for themselves. Valley Forge had transformed the Continental Army. Before that winter, it was a loose patchwork of frontiersmen, veterans, militiamen, and idealists, many of whom had never seen real combat. But through the vigorous trainings and discipline introduced by von Steuben, these disparate groups became a unified fighting force. The army that had entered Valley Forge in the winter of 1777 was not the same one that marched out in June of 1778. Hardened, trained, and disciplined, the army that met the British at Monmouth was light years ahead of the ragtag force that it had been months earlier. The battle demonstrated that Valley Forge had changed the course of the war. Though the Battle of Monmouth was tactically inconclusive, it was a turning point for the Americans, proving that they could stand their ground against one of the world's most powerful armies. The Continental Army had been tested, and for the first time, it had passed with flying colors. Monmouth was just the beginning. The tide of the war was just starting to turn.